Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ATSU's 19th Annual Michael A. Creedon Memorial Lecture on Aging. My name is Elton Bordenave, and I will be moderator for today's lecture. I am the director of the Center for Resilience and Aging here at AT Still. Just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. Today's lecture is being recorded, and all of those in attendance will be muted. You will have the opportunity to post questions on chat, and there will be time at the end of the lecture for questions, so our speaker will respond. On that note, our speaker today is Dr. Amanda Sokan. Dr. Sokan is an assistant professor of practice and co-program director in the Division of Public Health and Practice and Translational Science at the Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health at the University of Arizona. She holds a PhD in gerontology, a master's degree in healthcare administration, and a law degree. Her interests straddle the nexus of gerontology, healthcare, and law, including elder rights and justice, elder abuse, mistreatment, cultural competence, LGBTQ aging, and long-term care, among other topics. Dr. Sokan considers herself an applied gerontologist and is passionate about engaging with older adults, advocacy, teaching, and mentorship. In 2020, Dr. Sokan received the Gerontologist of the Year Award from the Arizona Geriatric Society. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Sokan so that she can deliver this year's lecture. Welcome, Doctor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so very much. I'm really excited to be here. I should just say this starting out. There's so much that I would like to talk about when we talk about elder abuse and mistreatment, and I'm going to have to try to condense that into the time allowed. So forgive me if I sort of gloss over certain things, but certainly feel free to ask me questions either afterwards or later on, should that be the case. So my title is Elder Abuse and Mistreatment, What You Should Know, Why You Should Care, and What You Can Do About It. And that's deliberate because these three things, what you should know, why you should care, and what you can do about it, are really related. And we are not going to be able to do anything without any of this. I like stories, and so I'll start with this one. It's only 3 minutes long, but please pay attention and I'll stop it when I need to. So here goes, a story unfolding.
Coming up on Aging Matters, abuse and exploitation.
There are over 5 million elder abuse victims in the United States. That is more than the combined total of child abuse victims and domestic violence victims. It can happen to any family at any income level, any religious group, any ethnic group.
Because there is a child protective services system in this country, people assume that a similar system is in place to protect older individuals. That's not the case. In the area of elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation, we are 40 years behind child protective services.
Those of us who work in this field know the impact of elder abuse. These are crimes. In Georgia, they are felonies, and therefore they need to be treated as such.
People who have been financially exploited are 3 times as likely as other individuals to die at a younger age.
Mostly, perpetrators are people the victim knows, trusts, and/or loves. It's not strangers. It's people who are very much in the center of that elder's life.
Once we have identified somebody who's being abused, once we have identified what services are necessary to reduce the future risk of that abuse, the service is not always available for that person, either in the part of the community that they live in or in general across the state.
To this day, I remain amazed and outraged that abuse of older people and adults with disabilities gets so little attention and so few resources.
I played that little clip, and that's a 27-minute long video. And there's another one that's even more awesome, where you actually get to meet people who were victims of elder abuse if they're still alive. But I played that to sort of set the stage and to help us understand just the gravity of the topic that we're about to encounter, and why people like you are in a vantage position to help us make some inroads into what really is a heinous crime, regardless of how you look at it, or a really great disservice. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let's talk definitions. And you would think that this is simple. This is one of the areas where there isn't one simple accepted definition for elder abuse and mistreatment. I mean, just look at the title. We started off with elder abuse. I'm already into elder abuse and mistreatment. And there's the reason for that, right? We have different definitions depending on where you are. Even in the United States, all the states in the United States do not have one central universal definition for elder abuse. And that's an issue and a challenge. But let's go with what's usually considered the generally accepted definition. And that is that elder abuse is an intentional or negligent act by any person that causes harm or serious risk of harm to an older adult. As I already said, there are many definitions, but this is sort of what I consider the baseline definition for it. Now, if I was talking to just a general group of people, I might be tempted, not really, but I might be tempted to stick with this definition. But I'm talking to people who I hope, who I know are in a position to make a change, and who I hope will make that change. And consequently, it becomes really important for you to have a better definition of elder abuse and mistreatment, right? Because that's really the bedrock for where we are. So, action on elder abuse, the World Health Organization, the International Society for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, we have a definition that I think is more encompassing and really descriptive. It makes it absolutely clear, right? And we use elder mistreatment. Some people use it interchangeably with elder abuse. We'll talk about that in a minute because I think language matters and what we call things matter. But let's say when I say elder mistreatment, I'm usually talking elder mistreatment and abuse. They're together for me, and we'll talk about why. So generally accepted definition, a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action. I love that. That means that an omission to do something that you should have done can be elder abuse. That's missing in that first definition. Occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust. That is absolutely critical. It's one of the reasons that the waters are so muddied, right? The other definition didn't have that. So the way that I explain this to my students is, if I walk down the road and I picked up a handbag and I clobbered a random 75-year-old man on the head with it, right? Is that elder abuse? Going by the first definition, yes. But we have laws for things like that, right? So it should be the same. If you assault an older person or assault a younger person, that should be the same thing. We don't need new laws for that. However, if there is an expectation of trust, that person is my older adult in-law or friend or somebody who trusts me, then you can see how we're talking about something different. That helps us in terms of addressing the challenges and in terms of picking up the things that we need to pick up. Okay, so back to it. So where there's an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. And then of course we were doing so well and then we had to mess it up and include self-neglect, right? And why is that a challenge? Because self-neglect is not something that somebody else does to you. That's something that you do to yourself. But I guess we needed to put all of these things under an umbrella. So to repeat that, because this definition is important, a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship where there is an expectation of trust, which causes harm or distress to an older person. Includes neglect, whether that's intentional, unintentional, passive, or active. So really, anything that causes harm or distress. And as I said before, includes self-neglect. And I hope that you see the critical difference between this definition and the one that went before. And just so that we're clear, I'm using this definition. So you probably have come across this, and I'm not going to belabor the point, but I thought that I might just list the different types of abuse. A lot of people are familiar with physical abuse for obvious reasons. It's physical, we can see. But there are other types of abuse that come under this umbrella of elder abuse and mistreatment. Emotional abuse, sexual abuse, exploitation, and that includes financial, right? Again, we've kind of muddied the waters. So when you have those scams against older people by people who are perfect strangers, that's not technically, if you follow my drift, elder mistreatment, because there's no expectation of trust. But there are many, many, many instances of financial exploitation that happens to older adults where there is an expectation of trust. And in true definition, that would be elder mistreatment. The other thing would just be fraudulent actions against a person of advanced age, I guess. There's neglect, we talked about abandonment, and then obviously self-neglect, which is where an older adult, for whatever reasons, is unable to take care of themselves and is self-neglecting, right? And there's the issue of, well, how do we come in and help them? The reason that I have this up and all together is because I want you to recognize not just the fact that there are different types of elder mistreatment, but also to know, or to give me the opportunity to say that it's not an either or situation, right? So where we find physical abuse, no surprise, emotional abuse might be there. If you have sexual abuse, that's usually some sort of physical abuse. So I say this to say that they're not mutually exclusive. You can have more than one, right? There's several of these things happening at the same time. They can be episodic, they can be recurrent, or they can be crisis-centered. So for instance, during COVID, there were a lot of, we had this influx of cases of suspected elder abuse and mistreatment, and that was crisis-centered. That came as a result of people trying to adapt to the new realities. Well, some of them came as a result of people having to adapt to the new realities that we found ourselves in under COVID, right? So episodic, recurrent, crisis-centered, it could be a one-off thing, it could be something that's perpetuated. It could be something else that's grown old. Domestic violence, for instance, grown old, right? Could in certain cases be considered as elder abuse and mistreatment. It's always good to know, and you heard someone talk about this in the video when she talked about just how many people we think. That number is now about 10%, it's still 10%. And that data has been, it's about 12 years old, right? And we're still at 10%. But we know certain things. We know that that 10% of older adults per year would have experienced one incident of elder mistreatment, right? So that's just one. We're not talking about recurrent ones. We know that 3 to 6% of community dwelling older adults are victims. And if you paid attention to the video, you heard the lady, at least one of them, talk about the fact that a lot of times when elder mistreatment occurs, it occurs because it's that expectation of trust in community dwelling older adults from the hands of family members or people they love or people who are in their social private spaces. But the important thing to note is that it occurs anywhere. If you watch television, you'd be forgiven for thinking that that elder abuse and mistreatment is something that only happens in long-term care facilities. The data shows otherwise. And there's reasons. It certainly happens there. But if you think about it, there's so many people coming and going that it's difficult, right, for us to expect this sort of stuff to go unnoticed and unchallenged. But in the dark corners of our private homes and spaces, right, there's all kinds of stuff happening. And this is probably a good place to say no one is better than elder mistreatment, right? There aren't any safe spaces. And in a minute, we'll talk about the reason why. But I should also mention, because I think it's important in terms of how we address elder mistreatment and the sort of solutions that we come up with, and our own reactions as professionals to it. Everyone who mistreats an older adult is not a bad person and a criminal. Now, don't get me wrong. We have the bad people and we have the criminals, and we should throw everything the legal justice system has on them. But we have very well-meaning people who are trying to do their best under circumstances where they're challenged or stressed or burdened, right? Or who are just ignorant of what's going on and find themselves somehow on the foul and the wrong side of elder mistreatment laws. For those sort of people, I would argue that throwing the might of the law against them is not the answer, because there's so many other things that we can do. And that's why this sort of opportunity is really important to me. We can provide information, we can provide awareness, we can provide respite and support and stuff like that, right? To help people cope. But back to my slide, equal opportunity transgression, if ever there was one, that's what elder mistreatment and abuse is. And we know it's a hidden epidemic because we do not have the numbers that we should have. The one thing that we are setting off is that it goes way underreported, and for all kinds of reasons. So talking about identifying and reporting elder mistreatment, because again, that's kind of how we get our numbers, that's how we know what's happening. It's really difficult to identify. Never mind the whole fiasco with the definitions, right? So what might amount to elder abuse in some place may not be at some place, right? So we have that, we need to straighten that out, but I don't know how, if we're ever going to manage to do that. But there are other reasons why it's difficult to identify elder abuse and mistreatment and to report it. So we have unlikely perpetrators, people that you would, like upstanding members of society and wonderful, loving children, spouses, caregivers, family members that we would never, ever think would do something like this. Again, remember the dichotomy that I presented earlier on, right? The criminally minded and the people who are just trying to get by, right? Two different categories, but both there. And unfortunately for a lot of people, still family members and people with whom we have a relationship of trust, right? And then there are so many things that happen that gets mistaken for usual aging. So for instance, we know that as you get older, skin gets thinner. It's so much easier to sort of explain a bruise on grandma's arm. She walked into a door, the dog fell on her, something. And we're more likely to believe that because, for one, we're not looking at those private spaces and those private people and saying, could you possibly be mistreatment, someone who's involved in elder mistreatment? No. If anything, when we in healthcare find an older adult who has a regular family member who comes with them to every meeting, right? Every healthcare encounter, who's awesome, right? Who's there with the records and the notes, we're more likely to give them halos than we are to give them horns, right? Because we're thinking something along this line. I'm going to pick on my friend here. I cannot believe that Lori, can find time to take such great care of her mom. She must be a saint. So if Lori comes in with her mom and her mom has a bruise on the arm and, oh, what happened? And Lori says, oh, mom was playing with the cat and something happened. I'm never going to say, I wonder if that's the only thing that happened. Because by nature, we want to be nice people, right? And that's part of the problem, right? Most cases go unreported for all kinds of reasons. Even when things happen, we might have victims who are unable or reluctant to report because, again, how do you, as a mother once said to me, how do you tell people that your child is abusing you, right? Just think about that. And then there's the devil is better than somebody else, right? So if I talk about this, they're going to take me away from my home. I'm going to have to go live in a facility or with other people. I don't want that. Then you have older adults who are isolated. You certainly have people who are afraid of the perpetrator and do not want to run afoul of them. But for a lot of people, it is just this intense feeling of shame that makes it difficult for them to step up. Right? And in those sort of cases, even when other people point this out, and that's another challenge with elder mistreatment, if an older adult is competent and they insist that nothing happened to them, even when you report it to APS, there's only so much that APS can do because they have that competence. And so all of these things work together to make elder abuse and mistreatment somewhat more invisible than it should ordinarily be. And we need to be aware of that. So why should you care? I've got a bucket load of reasons why you should care, and I got some of them here. Because if we don't do anything, right, then that person, if it's one of these recurrent things, is going to be subject to continued mistreatment because of whatever the triggers were. Certainly, people who suffer mistreatment have a very impoverished quality of life, regardless of what lens you're looking at that through. We know, if you don't care about the effect on the people, we know that quality of care issues are abound, right? Health outcomes are poor, there's increased morbidity, there's increased mortality, they're more likely to be institutionalized, right? And that's, and to use skilled nursing facilities and hospice, and of course, to consume big time healthcare dollars. So if we're looking and thinking, well, hey, your family, your luck, do the best that you can, we're always complaining about how much stuff costs and the amount of GDP that that healthcare consumes. That increased cost is something that all of us bear as a society. So if we are not feeling altruistic, maybe we might pay attention to that. And then as healthcare providers, we have all of these professional codes of ethics, right, that tell us what the moral standards of our profession are and hold us to them. We might want to think about that. We do a fantastic job of talking about patient-centered care and consumer-driven this and that. There is no way to provide patient-centered care or person-affirming care as a healthcare provider if we're two older adults, if we're not paying attention and keeping our eyes out for elder abuse and mistreatment. And the last one is just my thing, because I know it's only a matter of time before we get to a situation where someone says, I think I'm going to see if I can sue my healthcare provider because I live in California, my sister's in Kentucky, and she's been taking mom to see this healthcare provider like 3-4 times a year. And all this time she was being abused, right? How come they missed that? How come they never saw that? It's coming, people. So for whatever reason, there's a variety of reasons why we should care. Whether it's because of the consequences of people who in the last stage of their lives should really be able to live their lives out with dignity and not afraid of harm, whether it's because of the impact on our society and what it says about us, or whether it's to protect ourselves, right, from litigation, or whether it's to uphold the best standards of our professions. We really need to be doing a whole lot better. And the first thing that we're called upon to do is to maintain that high index of suspicion. Because all of this, increased morbidity, early death or premature death, these are terrible consequences. And if we can do something really little that prevents that or allows for early detection, we can stop that train before it becomes a train wreck. Okay, here is what I hope that if you don't remember anything, well, I hope you remember quite a few things, but here is something that helps me sort of conceptualize why elder mistreatment happens, right? So you have 3 players, really. You've got the environment, you've got the perpetrator, whether or not they intended to be a perpetrator, and then you have an older adult who's vulnerable. And vulnerability occurs in so many different ways. You can be vulnerable because you're dependent. You can be vulnerable because somebody else is dependent on you. You can be vulnerable because you have some sort of mild cognitive impairment or some sort of cognitive impairment. You can be vulnerable because you're frail. So it's not just frail older adult people, right? It's just something that makes you vulnerable. And then just the presence of somebody else who might turn out to be a perpetrator and the environment. And so we found situations where you have a vulnerable older adult, and you have people, and you have the environment, and one person gets mistreated and the other person doesn't. And the difference is in who's in the circle, right? Or the difference is in the environment. So take, for instance, you have someone who's living with their mother, right? Or they've moved in, and this is a true case. So daughter moves in with her boyfriend to take care of her mother after her father died, right? Everything's fine and everyone's living together happily until 2008 with the recession. Boyfriend loses his job, daughter loses her job, and all of a sudden everyone's dependent on the mother's money, and they start to use it. So in that case, what changed was the environment, right? And that became that trigger for risk. So we need to be aware of these things, which means that the social histories of our patients then become really critical, because that's the only way that we're going to understand who's in their environment, what's in their environment, and the different things that might cause them to be vulnerable. So having preached all that gospel and made all that noise, what should healthcare professionals know, right, to help or to do anything? We've talked about victims, perpetrators, and environment, and the way that these things sort of work together to create that perfect storm. We need to be able to tell the sort of risk and protective factors, things that are more likely to increase the risk that someone's going to be abused or be an abuser, and factors that are protective. We need to be a little bit more familiar with signs and things that we should be able to pick up. We need to be aware of useful practices and tools and resources, and quite a few of them out there. And we certainly need to know what are reporting laws, because hey, newsflash, every state in the US has reporting laws, but they are different, right? And states have mandatory reporting laws, and those mandatory reporting laws are different as well, because some states mandate who has to report elder abuse and mistreatment if they come across it. And that definition might differ depending on where you are. I'm not going to read this list. It's not finite, right? The whole idea of presenting this is twofold. One, I just want you to get a sense of just all the things that could be risk factors, and there are others, right? That's the first thing. The other thing that I want you to see is that there are certain risk factors that are present for both perpetrator and victim. And if they coexist, that's a double whammy. But they could just happen to be, to afflict one of them. So where a perpetrator, where a person, before they become a perpetrator, is dependent, for instance, financially on an older adult, that could be a risk factor. Where the older adult is dependent on the perpetrator, whether it's financially or more usually for care, right? That could be an issue. And so certain things are not surprising. Drug and alcohol abuse, right? Cognitive impairment, that sort of stuff. But there's some other things that I'd like for you to pay attention to. Inexperience. That's not a bad thing, right? We're not going to put that in the same sort of space as drug or alcohol abuse, but we know that a ton of elder mistreatment happens because the caregiver or the family member, whoever that perpetrator is either inexperienced or poorly educated, for instance, about whatever the condition is. And we find that a lot, especially when we're looking at persons who provide care for people who are living with dementia. So poor staffing, workplace challenges, right? Isolation, we already talked about vulnerability, income, education, race, ethnicity. There isn't anything about any particular race that makes them more likely, right, to be people who are either victims or perpetrators. It's the interlocking trajectories of socioeconomic status and stuff like that, right? So when you have, so when we talked about the recession, for instance, I mean, if you are a multimillionaire, right, that might not be the thing that brings you to the elder mistreatment table. Something else might, because millionaires too can be abused, right? But so we need to understand how these things play together and interact with each other. Again, warning signs, not going to read them, just to give you some a sort of a flavor. So let's take caregiver stress, because that's a big one, because the longer you live, the more likely it is that you're going to have a caregiver, right? So we know that caregivers who are stressed, misinformed, need respite, need support, are more likely to be perpetrators than those who are supported, right? And have the resources that they need. What are the triggers? Excessive concern about cost, someone who's dominating the older adult, refusing to let them talk, talking for them, overwhelming them, those kinds of things, right? Especially if this is a relationship that you are aware of. Taking another example, let's look at unexplained injuries. I already used the example of the thin skin. So you find someone who's minimizing an older adult's injuries or blaming the victim or others for mistreatment or exploitation, then those are sort of victim alerts, accidental injuries, right? When the mechanism, right, or the description or the etiology of the injury doesn't match the story of what's been reflected. So now we have forensic teams that can look at injuries, right, and the way they were described and what was supposed to have happened and tell whether there's a fit or not. So just different types of things that we can do or learn about. Regardless of what it is, the one thing that we find over and over again is that it's important to trust your instincts. If you feel some sort of concern, just ask questions. A lot of times people will say, well, I couldn't prove anything. We are not required to prove anything. We only need to report a suspicion and somebody else takes it from there. This is also a good place to repeat that most victims suffer more than one type of abuse. So different manifestations of elder mistreatment. The physical ones are usually more obvious because we can see that. Emotional abuse and neglect, that's a really touchy area, right? Sometimes you run into cultural aberrations that make certain things acceptable and not acceptable. So we have to be aware of that. But even something as simple as, and this is a true case, I know that my mom loves to, she's wheelchair bound, and she loves to watch, I almost said General Electric. No, it's not, General Hospital, right? And I say to her one day, you watch way too much of this, you should do something else. And I take the remote control and I put it on top of a shelf so that she could not get to it. Abuse or not? If you follow the definition, yes, it is. Right? And so it really becomes important for us to think about it. It doesn't have to be something of big magnitude. The other thing to stress is that abuse is not always physically visible. And a lot of times we're looking for those markers. Certainly sexual abuse, we know that these things occur. Some other day, I might be able to tell you some harrowing stories. Financial exploitation, again, that's very common in families, you know, sudden change in finances and accounts. We have banks now who help their tellers undergo elder abuse mistreatment training so that they can begin to pick up those triggers, you know. So what's an unusual behavior for an older adult in terms of their accounts and flag this? A lot of times it's things like, oh, loans or gifts, or even worse, well, you know, I sold the house because when mom dies, it's going to be my house anyway, right? You know, and you'll be amazed how many people think that's morally wrong, but not elder abuse and mistreatment, but it is. It's financial exploitation. You should wait and not be part of why mom dies until that happens to get the house. So whatever we do, this maintaining a high index of suspicion is a pretty important thing. And it's not to be bad people or to be trying to find bad things. It's just to be mindful and to be eyes and ears. So how do we help, right? Be part of the solution. Certainly sensitivity, awareness, education, because if you don't know about it, then you're never going to see it. As a doctor that I met once said, an ER physician, he said, I've never seen elder abuse, but I'm sure that it has seen me. It's just that I did not know what to pick out. We don't want to be those people, right? So if you can get help for the victim or the perpetrator or support groups, respite, depending on what the situation is. Again, for certain areas, it's going to have to be legal action, court-appointed conservators, etc. Now, you may not, depending on where you are, have to do this. A lot of healthcare systems now have case management groups that are specifically for elder abuse and mistreatment. So all you would need to do is refer to them, right? You can certainly always report to APS, the police, or other relevant body. So the relevant body would be saying if you had one in your wherever you worked. I've talked about the fact that mandatory reporting laws vary by state. Who's required to report also varies, even where that's mandated. And for quite a few states, the failure to report suspected, now that's the key, suspected. You don't have to be sure, you just have to suspect it, is a misdemeanor offense. So again, I don't think anyone's been charged yet in a lot of states, but it's on the books, right? So, and I guess that's part of the importance. I struggled with this slide, and I thought, should I just share this or not share this? Maintaining that high index of suspicion comes across again, right? It's being aware and being, and looking out for those flags and those triggers. But the thing that I want to talk about here is the ethical issues, right? Because there's no way for us to work with older adults without being mindful about things like competence and capacity and consent. Old people, just like everybody else, are entitled to make poor choices and poor decisions, right? And so unless we really have a reason to question their competence, right, and their capacity, right, or if we know that they're in danger, right, we have to balance those, and that becomes really tricky, right? But it would be foolhardy not to talk about that. So ethical issues are important. It's also important, regardless of what we do and where we stand on the issue, to place that older adult person at the center of the decision-making process, not their family member, not us, not what it's going to look like for our organization, but what's the best for that particular person, right? Continuity of care is important. When they leave us, what's going to happen, right? Because that's the abyss, and that's where elder mistreatment happens. And for a lot of people, we see things, we might be suspicious, we don't do anything about it. Documenting the process is important, because if you report to APS and somebody else reports another time, then those things, those little things can form a chain that's strong enough for APS to have to do something about it, as opposed to if we didn't. So every time we document, we create that paper trail that becomes important. There are tons of tools out there, validated tools, for screening if you suspect elder abuse or mistreatment. A lot of times when I talk to my healthcare colleagues, they talk about the lack of time in healthcare encounters to do anything. And so a long time ago, working with a physician, we came up with these 3 questions, and none of them, rocket science, right? It just gives us something to work with. So you have a patient who's an older adult who comes in, right? You just ask them, since the last time I saw you, has anybody been mean to you? Has anybody hurt you? Has anybody treated you in a way that you did not like or felt was disrespectful? That goes towards stuff like the emotional, right? And then depending on the results, you can then move on to the other thing. If it's a no, then it's there, right? Remembering to keep that high index of suspicion going. If you're having a physical exam, check areas, be open to what you might find, document any findings. If there's no concern, end of story. If there is one, then it goes up for investigation, right? And then it's always important to check that social or medical history, especially for older adults. We're going to have to get more comfortable with recognizing that the social is the medical and the medical is the social. And because those 2 things are linked, right, the legal then becomes thrown in there. Because if we don't do our work well as healthcare providers, and we miss out on the evidence, and this happens a lot of times, that when it gets to the police or law enforcement, they don't have enough to be able to proceed with that. Good news, there's a ton of things that we can do, interventions, and we don't have to be the ones to do it, because I'm sure people are going, oh my gosh, do I have to do this as well on top of everything else? No, but I think it's important for us to know that there are things that we can do to help people who are victims of elder abuse or mistreatment, and there's a ton of them there. And in most healthcare organizations, we're beginning to see some of these things. And we can also start before it happens. So in cases like where we have a patient gets, say, a dementia diagnosis, telling the caregivers and the family members upfront just how challenging, giving them a sense of how challenging this is going to be, right? Preempts that, right? Rather than waiting for them to figure this out, get burned out, have stuff happen. And a lot of times we could do a much better job about that. Again, if we think about the older adult and we put them at the center of everything that we do, including protective intervention decisions, we can do more good and reduce harm. So critical issues to think about. I already talked about the medical social model of care, which is what we really need to be thinking about when we're working with older adults. Multidisciplinary teams are particularly critical in this issue, and I'm sure you can see why: social services, criminal justice, healthcare, etc. Support groups, we need to know what's in our community. We need to provide these things, whether they're for victims or perpetrators, right? Especially because we have perpetrators who are not bad people with horns, or they're just, unfortunate where they are. We also need to do a lot more collaboration, right? Improving our body of knowledge, clearly defining what elder abuse and mistreatment is, right? What the biomarkers of mistreatment are, and really critical, how do we honor personhood for victims, right? And balance autonomy versus beneficence, because that's a really critical thing to do. So my take-home message: elder abuse and mistreatment, equal opportunity transgression, it's everywhere, right? You may not have seen it, but it's there. There's a higher incidence in community dwelling older adults. It's all about access, and reason and motive, right? And just the fact that when you think about caregiving, right, informal caregivers form the backdrop, right, of caregiving in the United States. So just think about every one of those people, right, and providing care, and the stresses and the stressors. And that should give you some sense of what the vista is. Vulnerability is a key risk factor, especially for the older adults. And sometimes for the perpetrators, depending on what we're looking at, right? Elder mistreatment is under-recognized, it's certainly under-diagnosed, and it's under-reported. We need to do a better job. We need to come closer to where child abuse is, right? And the question that I always ask is, if you wanted to identify an army of people who help protect children from child abuse and are the eyes and ears, who would you pick out? And straight away people say, well, schools and teachers and people who work with young adults. Exactly. Well, if we wanted to replicate that same formula for older adults, who would we pick out? All of a sudden we get silence in the room. And it's us. It's those of us in healthcare. Because for whatever reason, whether it's because of the comorbidities, whether it's because we're living longer but sicker lives, whether it's because there's normal changes that happen as we get older, right? We're seeing way more healthcare providers than maybe other groups of people. That puts us in the hot seat. That makes us the people who have that vantage position, makes us the school teacher equivalent for elder abuse. So when older adults come to see us, when we encounter them, we can help be the set of eyes and ears to pick this out. And again, really important to say, there is no requirement to be sure. There is no requirement to be certain. You just have to have a suspicion. And if you do, you can report it and somebody else can take care of that. And I like this thing, and this really came from what that physician told me, the ER physician: the eye cannot see what the mind does not know, right? And so first we have to fill ourselves up with that information. We have to be aware and sensitive to these issues. Otherwise, we will be like the ER physician who said to me, I'd never seen elder mistreatment in the ER, but I'm sure that it has seen me. I started with a story. I would like to end with a story. And this is Mickey Rooney. Some people may be too young that they don't know who he is, but hopefully we do. But here is Mickey Rooney's story.
In 2009, 1 in 7 older Americans was abused, according to a government study. On Wednesday, a Senate committee heard from a Hollywood legend who says he is one of those victims. CBS News congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes is on Capitol Hill this morning with the story. Nancy, good morning.
Erica, good morning to you. Mickey Rooney was one of the biggest names in movies for decades, and his message to Congress was, if abuse could happen to him, it could happen to any senior.
I felt trapped, scared, frustrated.
The 90-year-old veteran of the silver screen told lawmakers he was the victim of elder abuse for years before coming forward last month.
Even when I tried to speak up, I was told to shut up.
Creedon's dancing and singing and effervescent characters delighted viewers for decades, made more than 200 movies. But in February, the frail Californian obtained a temporary restraining order against his 52-year-old stepson, complaining that the son of his 8th and current wife had, quote, taken control of Mickey's personal and financial affairs and was verbally abusive, depriving him of medicine and food, even confiscating his identification to prevent him from traveling.
I was eventually and completely stripped of the ability to make even the most basic decisions.
His stepson denies the allegations, but Rooney's story is far from unique.
I am here today because it's so important that I share my story with others.
It's estimated that between 700,000 and 3.5 million older Americans are abused, neglected, or exploited each year, and that only 1 in 6 cases are reported.
Were you glad that you had a chance to share your story?
Everything you heard me say today was real.
And he hopes other seniors will not wait as long as he did to get help.
Rooney says his abusers even took away his Oscar and his Emmy. He says he eventually became practically a prisoner in his own home, Erica.
It's just awful to think about. What are lawmakers actually hoping to achieve? Why are they holding these hearings?
Well, they're looking at possibly reintroducing legislation that would beef up penalties for elder abuse. But what they said their immediate goal is just to shine a light on this problem so that victims or people who see it happening will step forward.
The picture that Mickey Rooney paints when he says that basically everything was taken away from him. Did he confide in someone at some point before this?
He didn't, Erica. He said he was, first of all, embarrassed that this had happened to him. He also said that he was afraid that he might be hurt, that his wife might be hurt, and that kept him from coming forward long after he realized that something serious was going on.
It certainly makes you think twice, doesn't it? Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill this morning. Thanks.
Okay, so I think I just ran out of time. So I'm going to stop there. I did have a really nice song by the Beatles, Will You Still Love Me? Will You Still Need Me When I'm 64? But, you know, you can listen to that when you get a copy of the PowerPoint if you want. So
Thank
that's
you.
what I have. I'll take questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sokan. Anyone has any questions at this time, you could go ahead and put them in there and we will have Dr. Sokan respond. We'll wait a moment here, give anybody a chance who would like to type in. You just type your questions in. So one question we have is, what is the age used for elder generally? What is your cutoff?
So usually it's 65. But if you look at different laws and different states, some people will start at 60, some people start at 55. I've actually even seen people start at 50. But just because the gerontologist will usually take 65, and so that's the number. Now, of course, you know, 65 is just as arbitrary as 55. There isn't anything that happens to you where you suddenly wake up on the morning of your 65th birthday. That's different. Right, so it's really just apples and oranges, depending on who's doing the counting. And that's another challenge because then it makes it difficult for us. Some of those studies would have interviewed people, or the participants would have been 50 years old, some would have been 60, but it is what it is. 65, but as low as 50.
There was another question that came up that said the broadcast said in 2009 it was 1 in 7 elderly were abused, and early in your presentation you indicated it was 1 in 10.
Yes.
And what's the have things improved, or what is the current trend?
So it's 1 in 10. That's the latest that we have. But like I said before, it's underreported. So it's just based on the research studies that we have and that we use. Now, here's the thing that I'll tell you though. A lot of people like me have gone away from saying 700,000 people or 1 million people, because 10%, right, is different. So what that means, 10% of however many older adults there were in 2009 versus 10% of the number of older adults that we have in 2023 is a huge chunk, right? Because we know that that population, that segment of the population is growing, and especially those who are the oldest, those 85 and older. So it's an increasingly larger problem with each passing year, unfortunately.
So are there really enough support systems, say for instance, respite, to financially and tangibly and practically support caregivers to help avoid burnout and teach caregivers how to manage hard situations? You suggest that should be a go-to intervention versus, say, coming down with penalties, but are there sufficient resources for that?
Okay, so first to clarify, those two things, one should not reduce the other. We should certainly have penalties and we should have the support things. What I was trying to clarify is that because of that interaction between victim, perpetrator, and environment, right, that we find perpetrators who really weren't trying to commit a crime. So quick example, siblings, 2 sisters, and I think they were, at the time that this happened, 85 and 89, and they had looked after their disabled brother for so many years, and they lived with them. And he was probably 82, and he was about 230 pounds and developed dementia. And so these 2 old ladies who couldn't keep him safe, because every night he would wander, right, got into the habit of lacing his tea, locking his doors, and tying him to the bed. Now, by any definition, that's elder mistreatment. But is that really what they were trying to do? And that's what I mean by we need to understand those distinctions. For those 2 little old ladies trying to take care of their brother, right? Prosecuting them and putting them in prison or whatever the law is going to do is not the answer. They've done a really good job of taking care of him. They were just beside themselves, right? And that's really different than the other story I told you about the daughter and the son and the boyfriend who moved in. So having clarified that, we should have penalties and we should apply them with all the force of the law on those who run the foul of it. But when we take people who are trying their hardest, right, putting them in jail is not the answer. It's providing them with resources. So like with these sisters, right, finding some way to intervene so that they would not have to be responsible for taking care of their brother at night. Now, do we have enough resources to provide for every caregiver? That would be like me asking if we have enough money to provide free scholarships for every child in the United States to get a free college education. No, we don't. But that doesn't mean that we should not try to do that when and if we can, right? So we can start little baby steps and have that as a goal. And in a lot of cases, what we have to do doesn't even have to be huge, right? The simple step, for instance, of making time to sit with someone whose relative has just received a dementia diagnosis to say, okay, let's have a real conversation about how this is going to go, right? Some days they're going to see monkeys, right? Your job is not to correct them and ensure that they recognize that there aren't any monkeys there and explain why this is going to be futile, but how the disease sort of evolves over time so that they know what to expect. No, they're not going to remember, but we can at least provide that information. Something else that we find, right? People take it personally. So if your father, and I usually say mother because we have more women, but if your dad gets to a point where he thinks that his things are getting stolen and that it is you and you're trying to harm him, if you don't understand that that's the disease, not him, right, you might respond in a way that's going to take you down that line. So they're really simple things that just require maybe those few minutes of patient education as well as caregiver, right, education, connecting people to resources, being aware of those resources, and of course, trying to put our money where our mouth is and creating some more resources. That's,
So there's
what-
two questions here that are kind of related to finances. One was,
Yes.
are there essentially can we be advocates, for example, for getting people in the financial industry to be more engaged with, like bank tellers would like to be trained to be able to be, to recognize this, as well as where do you report things? For example, if you suspect that an elderly person is being taken advantage of and convinced by family members to sell their assets, how do you report such a thing? So those are financial related.
Okay, great. So the good news is that we already have that happening, right? So we have communities where the bank staff participate in elder abuse or mistreatment webinars and training. And there was I forget which community now, but they actually came up, the Elder Abuse Council actually came up with these round purple badges, stickers that the banks could put on their front doors, which really signified that the tellers had been trained, right, to be able to pick up these kinds of things. And so it's already happening. It's really not difficult. It's providing access to training. There's people like me and people like Dr. Reynolds can handle this kind of things, and a ton of other people who work in elder abuse and mistreatment. And it's really just helping people understand, in this particular case, what financial abuse looks like and what financial exploitation looks like. And the interesting thing is, it's really simple. Most people have patterns of behavior, right? And so it's recognizing those patterns. It's treating your customers like customers have been invested in them. It's recognizing those patterns and checking when something seems like it might be an aberration. It's just asking that question, and not also, for instance, if I walk in and I say, oh, remember me, I'm the caregiver for Mrs. Williams. She gave me this check to cash, right? And you look at it, it's like, wow, this is $500. The lady never cashes anything. She comes in and she collects $100 and say, okay, well, can you come back and let's do some checking. It's really a lot of little actions with a lot of love.
And so, and in terms of reporting suspected elder financial abuse.
So yeah, so you have three options depending on where you are. If you are in the bank, then your bank should have sort of a protocol for doing it, or you should at least report to your manager, etc. Now, regardless of where you are, who you are, you can always report to the to APS. And every state, if you Google your state and elder abuse, every state has toll-free numbers, email addresses for adult protective services. You can always they have a report line. You can always take a report to the police as well. So those are two areas where you can always go report. And depending on which state you're in and which community, because not all communities do that, but a lot of states now have elder abuse councils. I know that we have one in Tucson, right? And so that's another place that you could go report that. You could go make that sort of report.
So next question was, how can we better address the stigma of being a victim to help individuals feel more comfortable about coming forward or reporting abuse as practitioners?
That's a great question. I think one of the first things, at least from my perspective, and nobody died and made me an expert, but is language. I think I may be more likely to say that I think I'm being mistreated than to say that I'm being abused. The word elder abuse, there's just no good thing there, right? You said that elder abuse, it's just like, whoa, screech, right? And I think that's why my preference is for the term elder mistreatment, because it doesn't carry the same sort of negative connotations. That's for one. The second thing is to make this distinction that I keep trying to make between the criminals, right, and and the other people who in certain ways are as much victims as the people who end up being the victims. And if we can clarify those distinctions and we can talk about those things and we can say, well, if this is happening to you, we can provide help for your family member or your caregiver or whatever, right? Then I'm probably less likely to think that you're going to throw the book at them, and then I'm now going to have to be at the mercy of whatever social services wants to do to me. And then it's also educating older adults about what this is. One time a few years ago, I did an elder abuse presentation at as a group of churches in Paducah, Kentucky. And when I was done and packing up my stuff, this older lady had waited, and she walked up to me and she said, I don't know, but I think that I am a victim of elder abuse. Up until that point, she just thought stuff was happening, like people behave bad, whatever. And I said, well, talk to me. And yes, she was, but she until that point, until she heard the description, she hadn't thought that that was her. And so we do have a lot of work to do in educating not just professionals, but also older adults about this.
I see that we are at our 1 o'clock mark. And so I want to thank Dr. Sokan again, as well as everyone who attended today. The lecture itself will be posted on YouTube here shortly. So if you'd like to visit it again or share with your peers, please encourage them to go in and watch it. Thank you, Dr. Sokan. This was wonderful. And this concludes our 19th annual Michael A. Creedon Lecture on Aging. Thank you all.
Thank you.